Alrighty, beautiful people. Morgan here again. Got another author interview for you. Today we are talking with Mr. Allan Batchelder. Allan is the author of the Immortal, Treachery series, an epic fantasy series with a questionable protagonist that the likes of Kirkus Reviews and The Bookworm Speaks have raved over. Allan is a professional actor, educator, and former stand-up comedian. Allan has also written plays, screenplays, online articles, dialogue for computer games, greeting card sentiments, and more. So a very interesting and eclectic set of experiences that surely translate into his writing. At some points in the episode, there are brief drops in audio, like there will be no audio whatsoever, and this is due to the miracle of Skype interview technology. So please forgive that. Allan was a roaringly funny person to speak with. And without any further ado, we give you Mr. Allan Batchelder. Alrighty, folks. Well, thanks for joining us. We're here with Mr. Allan Batchelder. Allan, thanks very much for coming onto the podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Just to get started, please describe yourself and your work as of late and tell us a bit more about your newest release, the Immortal Treachery series.
Well, you did a very good job already, but I started out life as an actor, and my main interest was Shakespeare, although I kind of ran the gamut. I did some quite a bit of musical theater. I even appeared in a few operas. And then when I met my wife, we bought a house and I got a day job because, being a professional artist doesn't always pay the bills. And then I just needed more creative outlets. And I'd always been writing stories ever since I was a kid. And it was just a natural kind of segue. I started with plays and I dabbled with screenplays. And but what I really wanted to do was write stories inspired by the books I read growing up. So here I am today, trapped in a snowstorm in Seattle, Washington.
Indeed. And do you consider yourself as primarily a writer, or do you kind of just find that just another creative outlet for you now?
It's true. There's a lot of different creative identities here at play, so it's interesting.
Yeah, I love it. I can't see ever stopping. But, if you've been doing creative endeavors long enough, you have a sort of forced humility. By that, I mean it's been forced upon you by life and adversity. And I don't ever expect to be up there with George R.R. Martin or Mark Lawrence. And I do hope someday to get back on the stage. I did a lot of commercials locally, so that was another part of my life. I just need, I guess like so many of us do, I need an outlet for self-expression and for my imagination. Otherwise, I just go stir crazy, and you probably have the same experience.
Yeah, and I even use the exact same phrase, stir crazy, literally, because mine will just keep on going and going, thinking about all the problems in the world and all the things that are just wrong with the situation that that we're in or something, and just and be so not present. And creative work is a really great way to self-medicate even.
I love that you said that, because I think right now with the sort of the whole climate change issue and the political situation in the United States, so many of us feel helpless and powerless. And I actually get to explore some of those feelings in my writing. I can write characters who are loosely based on actual figures in the world and explore issues that are happening in the world. And I guess that's our contribution as writers. I can't go to Washington, D.C. and become a senator, but I can sort of explore the issues and the unfairnesses in my writing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So can you kind of tell us more about the plot of Immortal Treachery, and maybe if it does kind of segue into that sort of discussion of political situations in the real world and how you kind of explore that in fantasy.
It does sound pretty intense.
Yeah. So when I grew up, like so many of us, I was really into the Lord of the Rings, and I even read the Shannara series and Dragonlance, and but then and all of Feist. But then I started feeling that the world is full of more shades of gray than that, and I started steering away from that noble bright style of fantasy where Aragorn is a thoroughly good person and would never curse, to save his life. And I began getting into Joe Abercrombie and Steven Erikson and Glenn Cook, and it just felt like more real fantasy. And I know that's an oxymoron, whereas I'm just a moron, but I really thought there was a believability to it, that there aren't any real paladins in the world as such. Everybody's a little tainted, everybody's a little conflicted. Sometimes people do good without meaning to, other people do horrible things without meaning to. And so I wanted a protagonist who was accidentally a protagonist, who was really a selfish bastard, and he doesn't have a very good memory or sense of really who he is or where he came from. He kind of just lives in the moment and goes with the flow. And foolishly, perhaps, when I started writing, I envisioned a 5-book series from the get-go. That's a little overambitious, but that's what I wanted to do. And I guess I was thinking of Wagner's Ring Cycle. I know that sounds kind of pretentious, but I was forced to go every summer as a boy. And so I just pictured something larger than a trilogy. And so the first story is a standalone story. And I think the second is kind of standalone, but they also tell a much larger tale that, well, I don't want to give away the ending. Nothing is ever as it seems. Nothing is ever as it seems. And you get little clues over the 5 books that I hope will build to this, if Hollywood were writing the trailer, an earth-shattering climax, that will leave the reader changed in some way. That's my hope.
Yeah. It's quite remarkable, Allan, because it's like you mentioned, so many people, they start off with fantasy like Lord of the Rings, has really idealistic depictions of heroism, and then the opposite extreme, which is just extreme evil. Right. And it's just the battle between the two. And yet, and in the current, I don't know, I don't want to say the modern, more contemporary fantasy seems to be steering more towards having lots of very, like you said, conflicted characters that do things is kind of based on their own sense of what's right or wrong in the moment, and they're not moved by some like external force of good or evil necessarily. It's just kind of what's in them.
Well, we are the orcs too, right?
Yeah.
There are no orcs, and they couldn't possibly be worse than human beings are at their worst.
Right. In Tolkien's world, perhaps it's like the psychology of like a single human being is reflected in all of Middle Earth.
Like they're both.
Yeah. So you can be as evil as an orc, or you can be as wise as an elf, or as homey as a hobbit. Yeah. But it's the different facets. So perhaps we've just changed into a different direction of what we want our characters to be and what they reflect.
So Allan, do you think that the fantasy literature now, and you can, I guess, comment on your own works, is it less psychological, and is it more about communicating messages that are literal? I don't know how to, you know what I'm
better about like political climates and like trying to reflect the real world.
Yeah, more reflective of the real world as opposed to what Tolkien was doing, which is almost like a fantasy set within a broader creationist myth of his own making, because he started by building an entire separate universe, obviously.
Right. Yeah. So I don't want to speak condescendingly of Tolkien. I mean, none of us would be here having these conversations if it weren't for his brilliant work. But I don't think you can eat the same flavor of ice cream your entire life either. I think that you eventually get a little bored of the predictability, and you need to move on and branch into other things. In terms of the psychology of it, I think that we're being forced to acknowledge that our world is a darker, bleaker place, and maybe doesn't have some of the optimism or maybe the naivete that it did, generations ago. Or maybe we're just not in denial anymore. I teach social studies. That's my day job. And of course we had slavery, we had the Holocaust, we had, genocide of Native Americans, and those were all horrible things, but I don't think we were forced to confront them. Now we're looking at the world, and it's pretty inescapable when we see some of the things going on because of our access to media.
Yeah.
It's so easy for us to look now and see the devastation that's being caused. In terms of my own sort of psychology, I'm a middle-aged man now. Yesterday, I was this young characters, really speaking my own neuroses.
Indeed. Yeah, it goes back to the self-medicating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was much better than drinking, I can tell you that.
Well, you can't do both.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it can be an Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah, and a lot of writers apparently do like drink quite heavily, and it's something I didn't really know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a big thing.
Well, sometimes I have a little bourbon or a margarita or something. I read somewhere, write drunk and edit sober.
Yeah.
That's
I think
so
that
awesome. I love that.
That is
Certainly,
Hemingway.
Hemingway had his issues with alcohol, and had his chemical abuse issues, and
Well, it's like any other sort of creative. Like you think of a lot of rock stars who have substance abuse problems, and
it's putting it lightly in some cases.
So it's not too surprising, I guess. Obviously people don't see writing as so romantic as being a musician or something like that, but it's still sort of the same creative impulse. It's just a different medium.
Yeah, I think it's also quite insular as well compared to.
I just had kind of a weird epiphany as you were mentioning that, and I think the more grimdark, the more brutal, and the more shades of gray in today's fantasy makes escapism a little easier, because you can sort of see yourself living in that world. Like if I'm looking at Joe Abercrombie's writing, I know people who use that profanity. I know people who are violent. I know people who are amoral. And it makes it easier for me to get absorbed or submerged into that writing. As opposed to Tolkien, it's beautiful, it's fun, it's lyrical, but I can't really see myself in that world. You know what I mean? Yeah,
that's very true. It's more something to appreciate and aestheticize, maybe, rather than imagine yourself being there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's something to be said about how one relates to the primary characters in the story, because sometimes you'll almost pretend that you are one of the characters in certain stories. And then some, it's more like you're reading it purely as that external viewer looking in. I've read a couple of, at one point I read one of the Harry Potters. I think it was the second one, and I was, when I was a kid, and I was thinking so much of, I was pretending that I was Harry in many instances and trying to empathize, and it was a totally different experience than reading, like you said, something like Tolkien, where it's
something that's kind of objective as opposed to you're actually feeling a visceral connection with them.
Yeah. So I think it's quite interesting, Allan. Like you pointed out that there's a lot more incentives, I guess, in the way that fantasy is written in today for people to immerse themselves into it. I think that's quite an interesting thought.
So speaking about sort of intense submersion and protagonists and things like that, so you have a pretty intense plot in Immortal Treachery. So it's about this sort of questionable protagonist who, for whatever motivations, is trying to battle a wizard named the End of All Things, I believe. That's correct? Yes. So it's pretty epic in scale. But I've heard that Steel, Fire, and Blood, which is the first book, is actually quite funny. And you were a stand-up comedian in your previous sort of work. So does that kind of translate into how you wrote and trying to make the characters relatable, or how did that work into that?
Well, I have, unfortunately, a big part of my personality is inherently goofy. And made to remain completely serious for long periods of time. And so I've written in some characters who are just dorks, for lack of a better word. I think the tapestry is a lot richer when you have characters who are larger than life, and then you have characters who reflect life. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the characters is essentially the village idiot, not because he has any sort of disability, but he's just so impossibly naive. And his character arc is pretty fantastic. He changes a lot over the 5 books as he grows and he learns. But so the humor comes out of the characters rather than, set up punchline. It's the ways they behave in unusual circumstances. But I can't suppress that part of my personality. And if I've just written a horrific murder scene or something, it's kind of nice to give the audience a break. And in the very next scene, something slapsticky and silly happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. And I love when I'm reading something like a really dark fantasy, and there are those moments of just sublime comedy. Like I was reading. Why don't you give?
So I recently started reading Brandon Sanderson. He wrote the Mistborn trilogy, and yeah, it's like one of those very dark, sort of moody settings. Like the world is already apocalyptic, but there's like a ragtag group of rebels who are trying to get back the sort of government from an evil ruler. But they're hilarious. It's like an Ocean's 11 kind of feel. Like they're bickering and bantering, and it makes it so much easier to stomach. And I think I guess one of the problems that like we've kind of discussed about Game of Thrones is that there is so much darkness to it and not enough levity sometimes in the show or in the book.
Right.
Like you can't get through Clash of Kings.
Well, yeah, it's just at times it feels like a very vivid representation of medieval life, to the point where it's so extreme. There's tons of misogyny, there's violence, there's experience of famine, constant conflict, and there's wars going on, and there's political intrigue, and the way that the people in the story pursue certain desires, be they like for wealth, for fame, for power, or like lust, is just so in your face, and it happens at such a rapid fire pace. But his books are they're like Bibles times 2 in terms of how long they are, and and there's very little breaks where you have any chuckles in them, and that it becomes quite trying over time, I think. And but that's why I think it's interesting to speak to somebody, Allan, like yourself, who incorporates that part of your personality into your work. And I think it becomes a lot more relatable, because it's not always just darkness in life. There are parts where humor is kind of essential to get through tough times. And it's just like, God, did somebody throw a fucking pie already? And there has to be some sort of break.
It gets darker. It gets darker. But I kind of think of like a painter with a palette, and some painters, some writers, they use a limited range of colors and shades, and they do it super, super well. But I like to go all over the palette and try to use all of the different colors that I guess make up me or make up my life. And I can't focus unrelentingly on the bleak stuff. And I think Shakespeare's a really good model for that. And I think of two instances. One is, and I've mentioned this in other podcasts, but in Macbeth, Macbeth and his wife just murder the king in this really gruesome, horrible way. And the very next scene is this drunken porter coming out and talking about how alcohol makes you impotent. And it's this very funny monologue right after this gruesome murder. And then one of his earliest plays, Titus Andronicus, you may be familiar with this.
Yes.
He grinds up his enemies' sons and puts them in a pie and feeds them to her. But it's full of really black humor. I've been in the play, but I haven't seen a production where the audience doesn't laugh out loud. A, at the audacity of it, and B, at the just really dark humor. And it's a gem that I think is overlooked a lot by modern audiences. But so, Shakespeare's a pretty good model. If you have to steal from somebody or emulate somebody, you can do a lot worse.
Yeah, he is a very versatile writer for sure. Yeah. I mean, creating his own words and things like that.
Yeah.
And I've stolen a few of his more obscure or even defunct words and put them in my books just to see. Dictionary word underskinkers. We'll have to go look that up.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Allan, you've received a lot of great reviews for Steel, Blood, and Fire, and particularly for the protagonist, Tarman Vikers.
Yes.
What's the inspiration behind Vikers, and what was your intended impact with the character?
Initially, I wrote him for me. I grew up a child of the 70s, and my dad was very much into Clint Eastwood, spaghetti westerns, that character, the man with no name, and also Kurosawa's Yojimbo character. And I saw all the Bruce Lee movies. And my dad read a lot of Conan the Barbarian. And I grew up with the Iliad and the Odyssey and then Beowulf. So I really wanted to write an anti-hero character like any and all of those other characters I just mentioned. Someone who is a prodigy physically, in terms of his fighting ability, but whose motives and whose origins, like the man with no name, are unknowable. They're never entirely explained in the first several books anyway. Ultimately, we find out who he is and where he comes from and why he exists. But I just love that idea of facing kind of a supreme warrior who's more of a mystery than a man. And but we see him broken at times too. I don't know if you remember the one Clint Eastwood movie where he gets beaten up, to the point of being a cripple and has to go live in a cave until he's recovered, and then he comes back and defeats the bad guys. But I just very much like that idea. And, when you go back to literature like Beowulf or the Odyssey, you have these larger than life people with superhuman abilities. And I love that. And they have their downfalls. I mean, Beowulf dies eventually. So,
yeah.
Of course. Yeah. So all of that is what I was thinking of. And I kind of wrote it for myself, to be honest, just to see if I could create that sort of character and pay homage to that sort of character. And then I just fell in love with all the other characters and wanted to keep telling their stories as well.
Right.
There's a character in the story who starts out as a gigolo, and he's the everyman character that we follow all the way through the 5 books. And he might have the largest change in story arc of anyone. So he's a foil to Vikers, who is this almost superhuman character. And then we have an everyman character, and their paths intersect occasionally, but they'll end up together at the very end.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Charmin seems like a very remarkable sort of protagonist to put at the center, because usually the mysterious characters are either the antagonist or they're like, you know, like Gandalf the Wizard or something, like someone who helps from the side but is not necessarily the main character. But you've kind of made that figure the center of the story.
Yeah,
quite interesting.
And it is nice to have a protagonist that you actually don't know everything about, and at times you question whether or not they are the good guy, the bad guy, where they are in the spectrum. Then that's kind of a fun thing to read.
Well, I have to say in that regard, I think I was inspired by Glenn Cook, who I don't know if you're familiar with Glenn Cook. He wrote The Black Company and all the books that followed, and he inspired Steven Erikson and several other authors. And he's very minimalistic in terms of his descriptions, which allows you to imagine more and wonder more and think more. And I know there are those readers and writers who love exhaustive explanations. And you mentioned Sanderson, and his books are ginormous, and they're so full of description. Mine are a little more economical in that regard, because I think I'm more action-based in terms of things happening and happening and happening and happening at a pace that pulls you along.
Yeah, and those are fun too, right? And this is not a fantasy book by any means, but I've been reading the Da Vinci Code, and it's just like that same pattern. It's just relentless, one big reveal, and then it's just action. And I love that book. Yeah, it's such a great. It's the first time I've ever read it, and you reach the end, you realize, oh, this was all in like one night. you know, like, and I was like, at any point, do they go to the bathroom? Do they eat? You know, I'd just be exhausted. You know, have to go and like, you know, at one point they're on the plane to London. They pop open some like warm Cokes and have them. Like, oh, you know, that's it. But this is all one night, and it's just one thing after the other. It's like clockwork, and you're just so absorbed into it because it's like you want to know what happens next, and you know, I mean, I couldn't have read this when I was younger. I wouldn't have been able to follow it for the life of me. But you start piecing together all these little cryptographic meanings and different symbols and codes and stuff, and then it all starts to make sense by the end. But there's still stuff that it's a huge reveal, and you think you've got it, and then you know, Dan Brown just slaps you in the face a little bit and goes, "No, it's actually this." You go, "Oh, okay. Yeah. This guy's actually the bad guy the whole time," you know.
Like the explanation is weaved throughout the text, and it's kind of at the end that you realize what's actually happening, as opposed to like having a big event, stopping, explaining, and then like kind of going on from there.
Yeah, kind of like The Sixth Sense, the movie The Sixth Sense in that regard. You think you know what's happening, and then get to the big reveal at the end. You look back and go, I missed or misinterpreted all of those clues.
Yeah, they just lead you along in a different way.
And funny enough, Alan, like for some people that's very frustrating, but I guess it's very dependent on the temperament of the reader. But like it's, some people don't really like that, but I love it when there's something like that where you figure out all along you've been kind of led astray, so to speak. But then,
it's funny you should mention that because I was just writing about this in one of my Facebook writing groups, that it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine when people, and this hasn't happened to me so much, but it's happened to a lot of my friends. They'll rate a book 1 or 2 stars, and they'll say, I was really enjoying this book, but it had this scene in it, or it had profanity, or it was too depressing. And I feel like that's more an issue with the reader than the story being told. You know, if it's just not simply to your taste, that I don't think that should penalize the author. I think that's just, it wasn't to your taste.
Yeah,
it's very hard to be objective about books, but yeah, you're right. We were talking about how Goodreads reviews really affect the author's
it's cesspool, attacking the author at times and not focusing on the piece of work that they've done. And, it's just so sad.
It affects your livelihood as well, right? Like if you have lower stars, like I've heard like some reviews just describing things that didn't actually happen in the book. It was just the readers confusing two different books.
Right, or they'll say, this
yeah.
book changed perspective so many times. Well, some people, that's their bread and butter. They eat that up, love it. And so I don't feel like that should be a penalty. But you're right, Goodreads does, I think Steel, Blood, and Fire is 4.6 or 7 or 8 on Amazon, and it's 4.2 on Goodreads. There are people who, feel like they're professional critics, and it's their job to. And you know what? If you're going to put your work out there, then you got to take what comes. I learned that in acting and stand-up comedy. You cannot please everyone.
Right.
And at the same time, Shakespeare said, everyone can master a grief, but he that has it. And to me, that means like everyone knows how to do something better than the person who's doing it.
Yeah.
Can, coach the local football team better than the actual coach, and everyone can pitch better than the starting pitcher. And, it's easy to give somebody else advice about how they should do it. Creating is one thing, but criticizing is just too easy, I think.
Yeah. Everyone thinks that they can do a better job, but they've actually never written anything or taken the courage to do that.
Yeah, and some of the things are just so nitpicky. It's like, come on, have some mercy.
I'm about 2/3 of the way through the 5th and final book of the series, which has taken me, Patrick Rothfuss amount of time to write. It's just taken me forever. And I think part of it has been the change in political climate here, because I come home every day and I just watch the news hoping for something different. But after that, I'm writing a steampunk with my son, who's an illustrator, so he's going to do some illustrations.
Oh, that's awesome.
A horror novel in my head, and then I'm going to come back to fantasy.
That's awesome.
So if I live long enough, I'll get all of that done. Do either of you write?
Yeah, we both do. But Shalini's actually written a full book and is still kind of working on stuff. We're going to talk about it.
Yeah, so I self-published a novel when I was around 12 years old. So I'm still working with that novel because I find it so interesting, and I just adding more things that I'm learning as I'm growing older. So it's a fantasy, and it's a young adult, and basically it's about another planet where there's aliens who are actually like elves and dwarves and demons and things like that. So they're mythical creatures, and they come down, they take 2 teenagers from this planet and take them back and try to teach them better ways of living. So very sort of relevant to today's sort of ideas, because we actually only have a year to change everything about climate change and war and poverty and inequality before the bad aliens kind of destroy our world. So
wow, and I can see that being really popular with today's. I teach middle school, and I could see them eating that up.
Yeah. So I'm very eager to kind of get that going and keep pushing along so I can finally get it maybe traditionally published or self-publish it myself, but I'm still working on tweaking it to make it like the best sort of product that I can make for right now, at least. I know I could keep writing forever and ever, but I don't want to.
I mean, at a certain point you do have to sort of let go and move on. I know that Tennessee Williams was constantly tinkering and rewriting The Glass Menagerie or Cat on a Hot Tin Roof over decades, and eventually you just kind of say, okay, that's done, and I need to tell a new story.
Yeah, for sure.
I've just been kind of doing drafts of different chapters, and it's been still kind of in the outline stage. I've nowhere near, like, I haven't self-published it or anything. So yeah, but there's other short story ideas that I want to, and I really like the idea of shorts, like as time goes on, because I think there's much less commitment required, and being, I think we're quite similar. Like we have our full-time jobs, and then we, on the side, we want to be able to pursue these creative things. And just doing a novel is very, very taxing, at least at the moment. So I just want to see if I can do some short stories as well, but kind of chip away at the novel as time goes.
No, I get that. Wouldn't it be great though if we lived in a world where the creators could just create 24/7
Yeah.
Right?
and other people could go do the jobs that they're passionate about or good about,
Yeah.
So what are your routines like? When I'm in the zone, I try to do 500 words a day. Typically that's at night. What kind of and then I give myself long range deadlines too. Like I have to be this many thousand words in, or the first draft has to be done in this month. How do you what's your routine like?
Kind of try and write wherever I can. And what I do is I kind of think every day of different scenes that I want to revise or add a new tidbit to. I'm doing a course on climate change at school, actually. So, yeah, it's dovetailing into it. So I'm adding little bits and pieces from the course. So yeah, so I'm kind of doing it on the fly. But yeah, I like sitting down and just doing a whole scene or part of a scene and just working on that one day. So it's a bit more compact and easy to manage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like kind of like working out. Like as long as if you have the discipline, there's going to be times when you go and it's just like you're sloppy, you don't feel like doing it, totally not motivated. But as long as you just do it, that's kind of what matters for me. It's like you got to keep consistent.
I very much feel like even one sentence, if that's all I do in a night, one sentence further that I am, it's better than no sentences,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd say also, like, if I truly am not able to put anything on paper or words in the processing document, whatever format it is, I'll just read something, and then that'll kind of get my juices flowing, and then I'll be like, okay, now I can actually put down a couple, It's really just it's an interesting experience. It's just kind of feeling it out. It's very mood dependent as well. And there's some chapters where I feel like I can't really write this right now because I'm too cheerful, and I feel like that sometimes, and I will listen to music, and that'll kind of, and that'll steer me into the direction that I.
Well, the reason you're too cheerful is you're Canadian.
Yeah, exactly.
If you were an American, you wouldn't be so freaking cheerful right now.
Yeah. Maybe we should go to I don't know, New York or something, and just
I know.
California.
Just man, New York City, and I wanted to go my whole life, but I'm just like, there's too many humans there. It's just like too much.
I hear you.
Yeah,
it's too much going on.
And so Allan, you're in Seattle, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. We want to go because, and it's interesting. There's so many people out here that are fans of Seahawks, and I'm a big baseball fan. And so when the Toronto Blue Jays fly over and they play the Mariners.
So you're one of those. I was always wondering who those Toronto Blue Jays fans are in the stadium.
Yeah.
Yeah, this guy.
Yeah.
Well, we travel north for Sounders games, for soccer games.
Soccer's pretty big here too, and Canadians, but we hate hockey, so I don't care either way.
Yeah, sure. You hate hocky?
Well, yeah, no, I don't find it that
give up
interesting.
citizenship if you hate hockey and you're Canadian.
Yeah. There's a weird law. It's kind of like it's high treason to say that you don't like hockey.
So they sentence you to 4 years of curling lessons or something?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
But Allan, whatever you do, just if you happen to come to Canada, unless you're in Toronto, Ontario, do not say that you're a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and because they're, just don't, because they're the worst hockey team ever. They haven't won a Stanley Cup, which is like this winning the Super Bowl for hockey, since I think it's 67 or something.
Oh my God.
So they haven't won since then. They're a terrible club. But if you're in Toronto, they have the most intense, loyal fan base ever. I think in sports, I think that European soccer fans are kind of tame compared to Leafs fans at times. I'm serious. So.
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah, here, come to Vancouver, just say you're a Canucks fan and just pretend that you know the names of the players when people talk about them, and you're good to go.
Well, we're going to get a hockey team soon too, so we'll be able to have a rivalry.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go.
Yeah, and that always makes things interesting.
So I lived in Quebec for a year. When I was right out of high school, and I was forced to play hockey, and I couldn't skate. So, but I did score a goal with my head. It was somebody passed the puck off of my helmet into the goal. So
I love it.
That's great. Honorary Canadian for scoring a goal then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, seriously. Yeah, you're basically a minted Canadian if you've managed that. Yeah. Yeah, I'm surprised you're actually able to skate. I can't fall on my ass all the time if I go skating.
Well, I couldn't now. I'm too old and heavy, but yeah, back then it was interesting. I wouldn't do it again.
So Allan, just regarding your stand-up comedy years, worst bomb you've ever had. I'd love to hear that story because I find bombing hilarious, and I don't know. I think it's because it's ironic, right? Because the comedian and the audience are hoping that it's going to go well, and it just doesn't. But the fact that it doesn't is somehow funny to me, and I just
two come to mind. I was I got a gig at a Christian college locally, and I thought, well, I don't know. I had about 5 or 7 minutes worth of religious jokes, and I was about halfway through the set, and they were loving me, and I thought, okay, all right, I'm going to take a risk here. And I told these jokes, dead silence for the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and I left the stage to no reaction whatsoever. And then when I transitioned from opener to the middle set, I was hired to go do a gig in Idaho, and oftentimes your audiences are extremely drunk. I was in a college town. They're extremely drunk, and some of my humor is kind of esoteric and word-based, and maybe they didn't have the vocabulary, but you allow for some laughter in timing your set, and people weren't really laughing, so I ran out of material with 10 minutes to go.
Oh, no.
And so I called up the headliner, and she wasn't anywhere in the room because she was expecting me to go half an hour. And so there was this awkward kind of, whereas the headliner, she was very mad, really, really upset. But things got much better from there. I never bombed in the sense of people booing me or heckling me or anything like that. But to me, bombing was when they would just get quiet, or they would, go back to their own conversations or whatever. That's the weird thing about comedy is, and if I was up there playing guitar and singing, more people would be listening. So when you're doing comedy, they have conversations and they're drinking and they're eating their nachos or whatever. And you sometimes feel like a potted plant, like, I'm just here for you to look at occasionally. No.
Yeah.
But it's a younger person's game, too. I mean, I'm too old to be in smoke-filled rooms eating deep-fried food and drinking bad beer.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a very courageous sort of art form, I would say, because there is that element of unexpectedness. Like, you don't know if a Christian audience will react one way to a joke and then another way for another one. So
I'm sure they all went home and laughed in private.
They just didn't want to show it.
Yeah, it's great because they're more so worried, like, well, what are the Thompsons gonna think if I start laughing at this material?
Yeah.
So, what did we want to? Do we want to
wrap up with any? Okay, let me just ask a fantasy related casual question.
Sure.
So what are you currently reading, Allan?
I'm gonna dive into Bloody Rose, Nicholas Eames' second book. I've been reading a Tad Williams for quite a long time, and I'll get it finished eventually. But I also read a lot within my writing group. So I belong to a group on Facebook called Grimdarklings, and I read a lot of their works, and then they read mine. And it's kind of a support group and an inspirational group. But I also go through periods like September through November is all horror. That's all I read.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And then I do read some sort of detective thrillers, Michael Connelly's books, the Harry Bosch series. And sometimes I read historical fiction because I teach history. So, but yeah, right now I'm going to be diving into Bloody Rose.
Okay, so Allan, your social media, where people can find your books.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on all of the social media. So I'm on Instagram. I think it's just Tarman Vikers or T Vikers, maybe. I'm on Twitter. I have a Facebook page for Immortal Treachery, and I'm on Goodreads, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm a huge believer in social media, although it's a gigantic time suck too. And that's the other thing. I mean, that's a whole other interview we can do someday, just talking about how you market yourself as an indie author. Although I have a publisher now, but still, the burden is mostly on me. You can find me all over. Gosh, I'm even on Tumblr, and nobody goes to Tumblr anymore.
Yeah.
It's true.
Good old Tumblr.
Yeah.
If I'd said, gosh, what was that one? MySpace. I'm on MySpace. No.
Yeah.
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 I'm etched into the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
You can find me via Pigeon.
Yeah.
You can send me mail.
Where can people buy your books?
Everywhere now, thanks to Crossroad Press. But I guess most of them are sold through Amazon, but you could literally walk into a bookstore and order them. Or the ebooks are all over the place. They're on Smashwords and I think Kobo and Barnes and Noble, and yeah.
Alrighty, well, Mr. Allan Batchelder, thank you very much for coming on to the High Fantasy Podcast. It's been fascinating conversation. You're a really interesting, funny man, and you have a lot of interesting takes on things. And we just wanted to say we thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. And perhaps we can have another conversation at some point as well, if the stars align.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'd love to keep in touch, Allan.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Take care,
Allan. Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well. Thanks.